to start last class, we talked about that thing from that Netflix show, Dracula. And of course, like as soon as I get out of class, like I see like this like interview with Deirdre McCluskey talking about like, the same sort of stuff. So I figured I'd toss it on this slide because I don't know. Whenever I talk about something in class, I get a really good example of it right afterwards. So Deirdre McCluskey writes about the Industrial Revolution and about how like the free market system works quite a bit. For her, in this interview, she said the virtue of capitalism is the ability to try things out. But she really focuses on entrepreneurship and new ideas and the importance that these have in helping satisfy people in an economy, about making things better for people. In England, in about around the 19th century, they began to be more open to commerce, and I don't know, the old hierarchical system of like feudalism was like slowly being destroyed, and normal people could go and start a business. If they had an idea, they could go try to get funding for it and begin selling a product or offering that service. And she notes that the government, because I put this in parentheses, because they don't have the incentives created by profit and loss, ill-equipped to choose such winners and losers that we can only determine through the market process. And whether these products, these new ideas, whether they meet consumer needs or whether it's a waste of resources. She says the other virtue is massive altruism. So some new product doesn't survive over the long term unless it's profitable. The firm can actually make money from it. So she says being profitable, the definition from an economic sense, is that this entrepreneur who comes up with this new idea has found something that a lot of people find desirable. If you get central heating in the cold or central air in hot. Being unprofitable means that you're harming people. This is a negative thing for society because you're wasting resources on things that people don't want. Again, this is why it's important that firms, when they face a hard budget constraint, that these losses force them in moving into different products or to changing what they're offering because they're wasting resources that we could be using for something better. He says, so far markets are the most altruistic system we have. It's the best way we've been able to come together to determine what should be produced, how much of it should be produced, how we should produce it, how to answer all those questions. Okay. So last week we were talking about basically the demand curve, how demand, how it's downward sloping, and how the 5 variables that influences demand. After class, I looked up whether government intervention could be considered its own thing, or whether how the policy is shaped if it just changes one of those 5 variables, and I got both answers, depending on like the source. So for the exam, you don't need to know government intervention as like one of the variables. I'm not going to ask a question like trying to trick you guys with it. For those of you who weren't there or don't remember, we talked about these 5 variables that influence market demand. Tricia asked if government policy could be one of those, because obviously you can see government policy influencing demand, and it does often change people's demand. So it can either affect people's income or the price of related goods or tastes and preferences, expected future prices. Or some textbooks just consider it its own thing. But obviously this is another thing. This isn't an exhaustive list, but it's like the most important variables that influence the market demand. Okay, so you can have both a change in demand and a change in the quantity demanded. Obviously these sound very much alike, but there's a difference in what's going on between these two. So a change in the price of a product moves along the demand curve. So this is a change in the quantity demanded. So if you got this demand curve right here, and the price drops from $450 to $400, you're moving along that demand curve. So we're going to go from, in this case, 3 million units being sold to 4 million units being sold. Remember, as it gets cheaper, more people are going to be willing to buy it. The demand curve stays the same, so it's a change in the quantity demanded. Again, price moves, quantity demanded moves. You can also have a change in demand, and that means a shift in the demand curve. So this is one of those 5 variables. If there's a change in one of them, you see the entire demand curve shift. So it moves from here out to here. Yeah, so if we move from point A to point C, the price has not changed from $450, but because the demand curve shifted to the right, it increased, we now have 5 million units being demanded instead of 3 million units. So in this case, the entire demand curve shifts out because of maybe a change in preferences and taste. People, this is still smartwatches. Maybe, I don't know, people want more smartwatches because, I don't know, there's more integration with like apps from your smartphone, so it's more useful. Or maybe people become more healthy and they want to track how healthy they're being. The taste changed, so in a way that more people want them, so the demand curve is shifting out to increase demand. So that's the end of demand. You guys have any questions about demand from last time? All right, so let's jump into supply. Supply is fairly similar to demand, so we can go through this a little bit more quickly with the same basic stuff going on, with a few differences, obviously, because we're looking at producers instead of consumers. So the market supply is the decisions of firms about how much product to provide at various prices. Again, the market supply is the supply by all firms, like offering the product. You can also have like the individual supply of just how much one firm chooses to produce. Like demand, supply isn't fixed, but it's determined by price. So as the price you can get for a product changes, the more or less a firm is going to produce. So here we have the supply schedule. So same basic idea as the demand schedule, where you just have the price here and then the quantity that's going to be produced at that price. And it just shows the relationship. Here's the supply curve, which is something we're going to work with a lot more than the supply schedule. Again, it's the same basic graph. Before you got the price on the y-axis and the quantity on the x-axis. This time supply slopes upwards, so it's the opposite of demand. So in this case, if it's $250 for a smartwatch, there's going to be 3 million produced. If it's $450 for a smartwatch, 7 million are going to be produced. Anyone have a guess at why a firm would be willing to produce more when you get a higher price for it? So remember, it's not just this industry that we're thinking about. The resources that can be used to make, in this case, a smartwatch, can be used for a lot of other things. I mean, it could be used for smartphones, like very simply, or it could be used for television or something totally different. The gold and the microchips can be used for jewelry. There are a lot of different uses for the things that go into there. So if you're only making $250 for a smartwatch, you can't spend as much on the resources going into it like you can if you're making $450 on a smartwatch. Because you're bidding against those other industries or other products for those resources, the resources are going to, the products with the greatest price that you can get for them are going to get, be able to spend more on those resources. So if if they can sell cell phones for $600 a piece, obviously that's more than like the smartwatches. So the people producing, or the firms producing smartphones are going to be willing to spend more, to buy more resources in order to produce those than they will for smartwatches. This is the way that, earlier when we talked about, earlier in the semester, when we talked about the relative prices showing what products are of the greatest value to society, what provides the greatest utility. This is one of the ways that it happens, that we see. Because, I don't know, for instance, if the price for a smartwatch is $250, they can't spend a lot of money on resources in order to produce those. Whereas if the price increases to $450 because people value smartwatches more, they're going to be able to spend more on resources in order to produce those. So they're going to be able to produce more smartwatches. Basic idea is when you can get more money for it, you can spend more money creating it, so you can use less and less efficient methods or bid away resources from other uses. So the quantity supplied is the amount of a good or service that a firm is willing and able to supply at a given price. So in this case, at the price of $400, the quantity supplied is going to be 6 million. If the price would increase to $450, now they'd be willing to produce 7 million. So if they can get more, they're going to obviously get more money for it. They're obviously going to be willing to produce more. The law of supply is that holding everything else constant. So remember that ceteris paribus condition. An increase in the price causes an increase in the quantity supplied, and a decrease in price causes a decrease in the quantity supplied. So whereas demand was downward sloping, here we see supply is upward sloping. So if there's a change in something other than price that affects the supply, it causes the entire supply curve to shift. Same thing as when we had stuff, those variables changing and shifting the demand curve. So in this case, a shift to the right here. So moving from S1 to S3, that's going to be an increase in supply. And moving from S1 to S2 to the left is a decrease in supply. So as the supply curve shifts, the quantity supplied will change even if the price doesn't change. Again, the same thing as demand. So if you're here at this price and the supply curve shifts out, it increases, you're going to produce more even at the same price. There's no units there, but say it goes from 200 to 300. This is an example. Likewise, if the supply decreases, the curve moves from S1 to S2. At the same price, you're going to drop from Q1 to Q2 there, and you'll have a lower quantity supplied. So here are the 5 main factors that influence market supply: the price of inputs, technological change, the prices of substitutes in production, the number of firms in the market, and expected future prices. So we'll look at these individually. First is the change in prices of inputs. So inputs are the things used in the production of a good or service. It can be resources, it can be the actual labor that goes into it, involves the, what we call capital, or like the machines they use to produce it. So for the smartwatch example they keep using, inputs include the computer processor, the plastic that goes into it, the labor, I don't know, like the rubber for the band. So you increase the price of an input, it's going to decrease the profitability of selling the good. So it's going to cause a decrease in supply. Again, firms can use those resources to produce other goods, or completely different firms can use those resources to produce other goods. So you're going to have fewer being used for that product, in this case, smartwatches. Likewise, if you decrease the price of an input, that increases the profitability of selling the good. So we're going to see an increase in supply. You can afford to spend more money on resources that you're using for this good, because now you can make more money. You can get more back from each unit you sell. So you can withstand the higher cost. Next is a technological change. So a firm can experience a positive or negative shock in its ability to produce a given level of output with a given quantity of inputs. But we'll call this a technological change. Now, technological change doesn't just include like the actual technology being used. So like, I don't know, like the robots being used to make cars, replacing people on the assembly line making the cars. Technological changes in economics can also include new production methods, new management techniques, really anything that goes into the production of a good. So technological change, for instance, is a new, more productive variety of wheat that increases the supply of wheat. Maybe it's more resistant to drought. Or maybe it grows bigger, so each plant has more wheat on it. That's going to increase the supply of wheat. If there's government restrictions, like they place a new restriction on land use for agriculture, that could decrease the supply of wheat. Or if they say a certain percentage of your fields have to be left like ungrown every year to help save, nutrients, so it lasts longer in the long term. In the short term, that's going to decrease supply. I'm trying to think of another good example of a negative technological shock. It could be as simple as a really good manager leaving that had, a good technique for dealing with their employees and for organizing their production. If that manager leaves, takes their expertise, and they bring someone else in who's not as skilled as that first manager, that could be a negative technological shock if they end up with a worse method of production. Or even just like if a hurricane comes in and destroys, or any natural disaster, destroys some of the actual machines being used in the production process, another negative technological shock. I think it's easy for us to imagine like a positive technological advancement and how that can increase productivity. And I don't think we've defined productivity in this class yet. Basically, productivity is, an increase in productivity is being able to increase your output, like the amount of product that you can make with the same or with less inputs going into it. So you're able to make more at the same price or make the same amount at a cheaper price. All right, next is the prices of related goods in production. So many firms produce and sell alternate products. They don't just sell that one product. They'll offer like a whole range of products. So the farmer in the last example, they can grow wheat, they can grow corn, they can grow soybeans. If the price of soybeans rises, he's going to plant less corn, less wheat, because they can make more from soybeans. So it's going to increase that supply, and it's going to decrease the supply of corn or alternate crops. So that's similar to substitutes in the market or in the demand. In this case, corn, soybeans, these are different things you plant. You can only do like one at a time. Sometimes two products are produced together. They're more like complements. So if cattle provides beef and leather. So if you increase the price of beef, you're going to farm more cattle, raise more cattle, and then you're going to increase the supply of leather. Not because of anything going on in the market for leather, but because of what's going on in the market for beef. But because they're produced together, a change in one of those is going to shift the supply in the other. Does that make sense? I mean, the opposite could happen if you guys watch a lot of 80s movies, like right after Mad Max came out. The bad guys in all those movies wear leather just because people wanted to, like, I don't know, borrow from the success of Mad Max. So I was watching this movie called The Wraith. I don't know if you guys ever, any of you guys heard that? It's like one of Charlie Sheen's first movies. It's one of those just like terribly like awful, awesome 80s movies that like makes no sense. But like the bad guys, they're supposed to be like these like high school guys in like a small town in Arizona, but half of them are wearing leather like Mad Max like bad guys. So in that case, if you have an increase in supply of leather to like meet that new demand, we're going to get an increase in beef production as well, even though it's totally unrelated. The markets are totally unrelated. The production, because they're produced at the same, that's going to increase the supply of cattle or of beef. Next is the number of firms, and they put expected future prices together. So if there's more firms in a market, generally it's going to result in more of the product being available at any given price. Just because you have more firms producing, you're going to end up with more. So that's going to shift the supply curve to the right, going to increase supply. If there's fewer firms in a market, anyone think of an example of a market with fewer and fewer firms? In-store video rentals. I would say like record producers, but records are like vinyls are making a comeback. So maybe CDs. When you have fewer firms, the supply is going to decrease, just in general. Yeah, it's weird that they put these two together. But now, so for expected future prices, if a firm anticipates that the price of its product is going to be higher in the future, it may decrease its supply today in order to increase it in the future. So they're going to say, okay, so obviously we talked about before with expected future prices for demand. More people are going to buy now if they expect the price is going to increase later. If firms think the price is going to increase later, they're going to reduce the supply because they'll hold on to those and wait until the price is going to go up and make more off that. So what this tends to do is balance the price out. It's going to increase some in the short run because you've now reduced the supply. And then it's going to push down the price in the long run. It's not going to rise as high as both buyers and sellers project it will, because it's going to increase the supply in the future period. Once we put together supply and demand and talk about how basically talk about equilibrium, we can go through an example of how that's going to actually work in practice. Okay, so here, again, the change in the quantity supplied versus a change in supply. So a change in the price of the product being examined causes movement along the supply curve. So this is a change in the quantity supply. So if the price of smartphones drops, again, from 450 to 400, we're going to stay on the supply curve, and we're going to move from, in this case, point B to point A. I guess I said that backwards. So we're going to go from 6 million smartwatches being produced at $450 down to 5 being produced at $400. So for this movement along the supply curve, The supply curve stays where it's at. It does not move. You just move from one point to another along there. On the other hand, a change in supply is a shift in the supply curve entirely. So we're moving, in this example, we're shifting to the right, we're increasing supply. We're from point B to point C, so it's the same price at 450, but the quantity is increasing from 6 million to 8 million. Does this change in supply versus a change in quantity supplied make sense? Doesn't seem very important now, but when we work with shifting supply and demand curves, making sure we get this language right is going to be important. Okay. So we're about a half hour, a little over a half hour into class. Let's take a break. We're at a natural break in the lecture. Get a question from each side of the room. We can relax and recharge our brains and stuff. We'll start with you guys because there's more of you.
Thoughts on the halftime show?
Halftime show is very interesting.
I thought it was actually pretty good.
It was,
I
yeah.
think they did a good job, but obviously it was pretty
Was it the anniversary of the Janet Jackson Timberlake one?
I don't know.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the Super Bowl, so it's always like right around the same time.
Yeah.
I'm glad they're not going with like super over the hill acts anymore. I thought it was weird, the backup dancers for, I think it was J-Lo's. They had those like leather like harnesses around their chest,
Yeah.
but they were like cream colored, so it looked like they all had bad tan lines. That really threw me off at first until I realized what was going on. Everyone else like it? Just have like good opinions of it? Didn't realize J-Lo was so old. People were saying she's like 50 now. That's nuts. How about you guys over here? What's up?
Oh, chilling. I'm tired. And that's about it.
Oh, well, you guys have a question over here? This is easy. This could be about anything. It doesn't have to be about the class.
I think there should be a movement made to not allow Chick-fil-A ads on Sundays. That's just cool. You can't show me Chick-fil-A ads during the Super Bowl. No,
I don't know. During the Super Bowl's not too bad because it's like the end of the night.
yeah,
But like Sunday morning, that's the worst. You know what could be really good right now? I really go for some Chick-fil-A. I always get the cravings on Sunday mornings.
I don't know if that's if that aligns with them well, if they put it on a Sunday, because if they're closed on Sunday, why would you have ads on Sunday? But at the same time, I guess it gets people excited for Monday.
Gets people excited for Monday, and I mean, getting brand awareness and making people think about it's always a good thing, no matter when it is.
I'm just saying, just because it's Sunday, if they have everything else closed, I'm surprised.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
that is kind of surprising they don't just like not advertise on Sundays.
Would you be able to dictate that though?
Yeah, probably.
I mean, they could choose to not pay for a Super Bowl slot.
Oh, yeah.
That would be
Right.
easy. But yeah, regular commercials on Sundays, like I don't know how advertising works well enough.
I mean, if you
Any
can
marketing
choose-
majors in here that know that?
I mean, if you can choose like where you have your ads going, you can choose, and if you can choose for time slots, I'm sure you could just say, hey, Sunday,
Yeah. Even if it's like the same price.
yeah.
Maybe they'll make you pay for that and then they'll sell that slot to someone else. All right, if you guys don't want to ask the question, I'll ask you. What's your favorite fast food?
You ever had Cane's in Ohio?
I have not.
Like KFC, but really
Is it just like regular fried chicken or is it like the more like Cajun style? Like,
that's really
okay. Is that just like just in Ohio? Or is it like a Midwest thing?
Sure, yeah, probably Midwest. Yeah.
Yeah, because I've never like seen one like in real life.
Yeah. I just know we got it whenever we went to Ohio State. It was dang.
All right, besides Cane's.
Probably Chick-fil-A.
Chick-fil-A. Anyone else? No one over there eat fast food. Is it just me, or does Chick-fil-A seem like it's just like so much like higher quality than like other fast food? Or is it just the fact that everyone there's like smiling and nice to you, so like tricks you into liking it more? All right, someone over here have their hand up.
Yeah, they were talking about Cajun, so did you get to try those Cajun fries from Buffet?
No, I haven't been there yet.
Oh man, I had them yesterday. So
Next time I have like a really bad hangover, that's what I'm gonna do.
good.
It's gonna be glorious. If it's half as good as what you guys said, it's hard to imagine them not being good though.
That's gonna be the best we've ever ate.
All right, so market equilibrium. This is basically why we work with supply and demand curves. So market equilibrium is a situation where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. So when we put the two curves together, it's going to be where supply and demand cross. So markets with many buyers and many sellers are what's called perfectly competitive markets. So market equilibrium in one of these markets is going to be called a competitive market equilibrium. Because you have a bunch of buyers and sellers, all the sellers have to try to meet consumer needs. So they're going to try to offer either higher quality or lower price, maybe slightly different features on the product to try to appeal to the consumers. The consumers have power because they can go between different firms. So there's a lot of competition going on between them. So we call it a competitive market equilibrium. If there's just like one seller, it's still a market. It can still be an equilibrium, but you can't really call it competitive because there's just one firm offering the product. So the purpose of the market is to bring buyers and sellers together so that each party can make themselves better off through trade. And that's what we're going to explore through market equilibrium. So despite the fact that there's no central planner, that there's no, there's no one overseeing like where all the resources should go, how much they should be, products should be sold for. It's not a disorderly product process. It's not just like pure chaos. So this is the process of firms producing the types of goods and the quantity of goods that meet consumer needs. Obviously, consumer needs are going to change over time. Previously unmet needs, firms will figure out ways to meet them. So equilibrium is not permanent. It's often changing as we have new products, new innovation, or new consumer needs that they didn't realize before or slowly developed over time. So the market is going to move in the direction of equilibrium as exchange occurs and new knowledge is generated. So maybe firms find out through the market process that they're pricing the goods too high, that people don't value them that highly, so they have to lower the prices, and that lower the price towards equilibrium. Adam Smith called it the invisible hand, where he said it's as if producers and consumers are guided by an invisible hand towards equilibrium. Like it's literally pushing down on prices or pushing up on the quantity demanded to get us to that point. Because equilibrium so often changes, if a market would get to equilibrium, it wouldn't last very long because something new is happening to push it away from there. But it's always a process. Yeah, it's always occurring where we're moving towards equilibrium, even if we're not able to reach it. So obviously, firms would always prefer to sell products at a higher price than at a lower price because they're trying to make money. Their self-interest, however, forces them to sell at a lower price than what they would prefer, so that consumers will buy enough to maximize the producer's profit. Because they're competing against other producers, they're going to sell at a low enough price that they can get a bunch of customers to buy from them instead of to buy from one of their competitors. Likewise for consumers, they would always prefer to buy at a lower price. But because they want that product, because there are a ton of other consumers out there willing to buy it, they're going to have to pay a little bit more than, or even sometimes a lot more than what they would prefer. I mean, who wouldn't like to buy the new phone or new laptop for $1? But obviously, if those awesome products were only $1, firms wouldn't be able to produce that many because it's so expensive to make them. So there's a lot of competition between the different buyers that drives up the price. So this market pressure working on producers, push the price down, and consumers push the price up, forces the market to equilibrium. Now we're going to be working with supply and demand curves. Now these supply and demand curves aren't known in real life to the buyers and sellers. You can't open up the Wall Street Journal and find the market for automobiles with a supply and demand curve. We don't know them in real time, but this process occurs as if firms and consumers know them. And the market pressure has an effect on firms and consumers, even if they don't know exactly the slope of the demand curves. If you get an economics degree, especially if it's fairly math heavy, you can get a job for firms trying to estimate supply and demand curves. They pay a decent amount of money because it's so hard to figure these out in real time. Especially because so many levels of production don't exist. Like a firm produces, say, 6 million units, and they sell those, or they put them on the market to sell. They've produced 6 million, that's it. So that's 1 point on the supply curve. They can simultaneously produce a bunch of other points on the supply curve to estimate the supply curve. They only do that one. So that's why that's why people in those positions try to estimate it. So here we have market equilibrium. So in this case, we're going to do reams of paper. So right here, we have a downward sloping demand curve, and we have the upward sloping supply curve. Where they cross right here is where the quantity produced and the price are both exactly the same for supply and demand. So the equilibrium quantity in this case is 5. 5 million reams of paper. And the equilibrium price is going to be $350 for that, as for a ream of paper. I didn't change this my microphone. Sorry about that. Since buyers and sellers are going to trade the same quantity at the price of $350, we don't expect the price to change. Basically, we're going to have 5 million reams of paper on the market being produced and being sold, and consumers want that many at the price of $350. So at the end of the process, the end of like all the buying and selling, there's going to be 0 left over. So we don't expect the price to change. This is, the goal of the market. This is, in this case, all the gains from trade are exhausted. If you would sell it at a higher price, or if the firm tried to sell at a higher price, there would be let's say just like 351. It's like right up here. That's going to be up on the demand curve a little bit. So you're going to have more produced than you're going to have people willing to buy. So you're going to have some left over. In this case, at $350, you're in equilibrium, and as many as the firm produces, people are willing to buy. So, if the price was $400 instead, equilibrium is still $350, but producers try to sell at $400. Say they're not, because they don't know the supply and demand curves ahead of time, they're not sure where to price it, and maybe they do market research, and the market research is wrong. Maybe they're just guessing. It could be for any reason, but they price at $400 instead of $350. If that's the case, consumers are only going to want to buy 4 million. So where the $400 crosses the demand curve, now there's only 4 million, whereas the supply curve is 6 million. Firms are willing to sell more because they can get a higher price for it, but consumers are not willing to buy as many. There's a lot of consumers that say, that's just too much for me, I'll opt for something else. So what you end up with is a surplus of 2 million smart locks, or whatever product. So it's going to be literally the quantity supplied minus the quantity demand. So we've got 2 million units left over. So the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. So what's going to happen here? If we've got extra product sitting on the shelves not being sold, but it's already produced, so the firm already had to pay, they already bore the cost of production.
Lower the price.
They'll lower the price, try to get those off the shelves. So here we have the invisible hand pushing down on the price from 400 to 350. It's going to move down the supply and demand curve, and in theory, they drop it until $350. So they get back to equilibrium, and they sell all those extra units. Now let's look at the opposite situation. The price was $250. The price is $250, and equilibrium is still $350. If you look at the demand curve here at $250, there's 7 million being demanded by consumers. But at 250, producers can only afford to make 3 million. So in this case, the supply minus the demand, so 3 minus 7 is -4. So there's a shortage of 4 million units. So the quantity demanded, in this case, is greater than the quantity supplied. there's a lot more people out there that want the product than like the product that's out there is able to be bought. So what's going to happen here? So in this situation, seller is going to realize they can increase the price and still sell as many of the product as they want. So what they're going to do is slowly increase the price as the supply that they have like on their shelves. So you're going to move from 250 up towards 350. So this right here, the shortage is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller until they raise the price to $350, at which point the shortage disappears. As the price increases, firms can now afford to supply more units to the market. So now the quantity supplied increases, and because the price is increasing, the quantity demanded decreases. And this quantity supplied is going to increase, and quantity demanded is going to decrease until they reach 5 million units, that equilibrium amount. All right. Price is determined by the interaction of buyers and sellers, so it's both sides of the market. It's not just supply that matters, not just demand that matters. If there's a lot of buyers and sellers in the market, no group can dictate the price in a competitive market. Firms can't just establish a price and force people to pay for it. If they set it too high, you get a surplus, the people are unwilling to pay for it. Likewise, consumers can't band together and say, you're going to sell this at a lower price, because firms won't be able to produce enough. So there will be a shortage. Both parties, both buyers and sellers, have and are able to exert market power over each other. So it's their interaction, it's their buying and selling, refusing to buy and sell, that moves price and the quantity. So changes in supply or changes in demand overall is going to affect the price and quantity traded. Even though neither group has the power to force the other into a certain price or a certain quantity, changes in the supply and demand curve are going to influence the price and quantity. Okay. So before we get to that, let's talk about real life examples of say competitive pressure helping to lower price. Well, back in like the 1960s and 70s, the airline industry was heavily regulated by the government. They basically set all the prices for tickets, for flights, told them what they were going, the airlines, what they were going to sell at. In the late 70s, under Jimmy Carter, they largely deregulated the airline industry, allowing airlines to set the prices to determine where they wanted their flights to go. They injected a lot of competition in the market. Initially, the prices stayed the same. Oh, and they had the price controls were higher than what was the competitive equilibrium. For a time, it stayed high, and the airlines just took the extra profit. But then one airline that was a little bit smaller than the others wanted greater market share, so they dropped their prices a little bit for tickets. More people, bought tickets from them instead of one of their competitors, a little bit cheaper. So then someone else chiseled away at that and dropped price slightly lower, and then someone else slightly lower, someone else slightly lower, and within a few years, they competed all the way down to the market equilibrium. So while it sounds like something that happens in theory, but not what you would see in the real world, as a real life example of price being artificially high and realizing that and moving down. Because all these firms are self-interested, they're trying to increase their market share. They were willing to trade a little bit of like the price they could get from each unit to sell more units. And slowly over time, well, not very slowly, but over time they were able to force it all the way down to equilibrium. At that point, it wasn't profitable for them to go any lower. Okay, so the effects of demand and supply shifts on equilibrium. So if we want to make predictions about the price and the quantity in our model, it's going to require us to know about supply and demand curves. So typically we know the price and the quantity, but we don't know the curves themselves. In practice, in the real world, not with the examples we're using. So what we can really gather from our model of supply and demand is its ability to predict the directional changes in price and quantity. So while we're not going to be able to estimate for a real market what the new quantity is going to be or what the new price is going to be, we can say it's going to increase or decrease by which way the curve shifts. So here's market for smartwatches before Apple enters. Once Apple enters, we have an additional competitor. So that's going to increase the supply, shift the supply curve to the right. It's going to move it from here to here. So by increasing supply, what we're going to do is increase the quantity that's being produced. And in this case, because equilibrium is where the supply and demand curve crosses, instead of this being the same price like we did before with just the supply curve, now we're going to move along the demand curve. So we're going to move from this supply curve to the new supply curve. So it's going to decrease the price while increasing the quantity. Now, because we don't know the actual supply and demand curves for this market, we can't say it's going to go from $410 to $380. We can't get the exact price change. What we can get is a direction it's going to move. For a lot of our examples, we are going to use prices and quantities. And obviously, we're going to be working with drawn supply and demand curves. Just know that this isn't something that, that firms can do in real life. They can try to estimate it, but they're not going to know these exact changes. Yeah. So for now, we can only predict the price will fall, the quantity traded is going to rise. Okay. We'll stop here for today because I want to use some of my own examples for this instead of what the book uses. So I'll be updating these and like changing the slides on Canvas. You guys have any questions about what we went over today?